Hi everyone. Miss you guys. We are going to be, I don't know, remote learning. So I'm going to do read aloud with you guys on holes. Now my class already started it. We're on chapter 4, but I'm going to reread chapters 1 through 4 so that you guys can catch up with us. And then I'll be doing read alouds through this, or maybe we'll do like a live one so you guys can comment. But I got to figure that all out still. So, this is my cat, Choo-Chee. Hi, Choo-Chee. You'll see him later. He's going to bother. So, Holes. This is by Louis Sachar. Sachar? I think that's how he says this. Kind of try to show you the pictures a little bit. Part 1. You're entering Camp Green Lake. There is no lake at Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. But that was over 100 years ago. Now it is just a dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a town of Green Lake as well. The town shriveled and dried up along with the lake and the people who lived there. During the summer, the daytime temperatures hovered around 95 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade. That's not much shade. There's not much shade in a big, dry lake. The only trees are two old oaks on the eastern edge of the lake. A hammock is stretched between the two trees, and a log cabin stands behind that. The campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock. It belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. Sorry, my cat's stepping on the thing. Okay. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under rocks and in the holes dug up by the campers. Here's a good rule to remember about rattlesnakes and scorpions. If you don't bother them, they don't bother you. Usually. Being bitten by a scorpion or even a rattlesnake is not the worst thing that could happen to you. You won't die. Usually. Sometimes a camper will try to be bitten by a scorpion or even a rattlesnake. Then he will get to spend a day or two recovering in his tent instead of having to dig a hole out on the lake. But you don't want to be bitten by a yellow spotted lizard. That's the worst thing that could happen to you. You will die a slow and painful death. Always. If you get bitten by a yellow spotted lizard, you might as well go back into the shade of the oak tree and lie in the hammock. There is nothing anyone can do to you anymore. Chapter 2. And I want you to think about chapter 1. Who would go to a camp called Camp Green Lake if there was no lake and it was hot and you dug holes and there was a warden? I know I've heard of the word warden before, and it's not good. Someone, that kind of runs a jail. Warden. Chapter 2. The reader is probably going to be asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? That's me. Most campers most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. If you take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it will turn him into a good boy. That was what most people thought. Stanley Yelnats was given a choice. The judge said, you may go to jail or you may go to Camp Green Lake. Stanley was from a poor family. He had never been to a camp before. You can comment, would you go to jail or would you go to Camp Green Lake? Chapter 3. Stanley Yelnats was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver with his seat turned around facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste, and a box of stationery his mother had given him. He promised to write to her at least once a week. He looked out the window, although there wasn't much to see, mostly fields of hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't air conditioned, and the hot, heavy air was almost as stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend that he was just going away to camp for a while, just like rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend the animals were at camp. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have them play soccer with a marble. Other times they'd run an obstacle course or go bungee jumping off a table tied to broken rubber bands. Now Stanley tried to pretend he was going to camp fun and games. Maybe he'd make some new friends, he thought. At least he'd be able to swim in the lake. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight, and the kids at the middle school often teased him about his size. Even his teachers sometimes made cruel comments without realizing it. On his last day of school, his math teacher, Mrs. Bell, taught ratios. As an example, she chose the heaviest kid in the class and the lightest kid in the class and had them weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boy. Mrs. Bell wrote the ratio on the board, 3-1. Unaware of how much embarrassment she had caused both of them. Stanley was arrested later that day. He looked at the guard who sat slumped in his seat and wondered if he had fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent for the crime in which he was convicted. He'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all because of his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whenever anything went wrong, they always blamed Stanley's no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who had stolen a pig from a one-legged gypsy, and she put a curse on him and all his descendants. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course, but whenever anything went wrong, it felt good to be able to blame someone. Things went wrong a lot. They always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked out the window at the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and fall of the telephone wire. In his mind, he could hear his father's gruffy voice softly singing to him. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely. He cries to the moo. If only. That's my singing. It was a song his father used to sing to him. The melody was sweet and sad, but Stanley's favorite part was when his father would howl the word moo. The bus hit a small bump and the guard sat up, instantly alert. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you need 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and just a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart and had a lot of perseverance. Once he started a project, he would work on it for years, often going days without sleep. He just never had any luck. Every time an experiment failed, Stanley could hear him cursing, his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Stanley's father was also named Stanley Yelnats. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yelnats III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yelnats IV. Everyone in his family had always liked the fact that Stanley Yelnats was spelled the same frontward and backward. I don't know if you could see. Let's see. Stanley Yelnats, right? If you look at the last name and you spelled it backwards, it would be the same name as the first name. See that? Interesting. So they kept naming their son Stanley. Stanley was an only child, as was every other Stanley Yelnats before him. All of them had something else in common. Despite their awful luck, they always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father liked to say, I learned from failure. But perhaps that was part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it wouldn't hurt so much every time their hopes were were crushed. Not every Stanley Yelnats had been a failure. Stanley's mother often pointed out whenever Stanley or his father became so discouraged that they actually started to believe in the curse. The first Stanley Yelnats, Stanley's great grandfather, had made a fortune in the stock market. He couldn't have been too unlucky. At such times, she neglected to mention the bad luck that befell the first Stanley Yelnats. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by the outlaw Kissin' Kate Barrow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would now be living in a mansion on a beach in California. Instead, they were crammed in a tiny apartment that smelled of burning rubber and foot odor. If only, if only. The apartment smelled the way it did before Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. The first person who finds a use for old sneakers, he said, will be a very rich man. It was the latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed with when he first found out that his great-grandfather was robbed by Kissin' Kate Barrow. True, he would have preferred living on the beach in California, but it was still kind of cool to have someone in your family robbed by a famous outlaw. Kate Barrow didn't actually kiss Stanley's great-great-grandfather, or great-grandfather. That would have been really cool. But she only kissed the men she killed. Instead, she robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of the desert. He was lucky to have survived, Stanley's mother was quick to point out. The bus was slowing down. The guard grunted as he stretched his arms. "Welcome to Camp Green Lake," said the driver. Stanley looked out the dirty window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. Okay, that is chapters 1 through 3.